we are ready to go back to work here, guys. So, our presenter is Bud Colligan, the Senior Advisor for International Affairs and Trade in the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. Colligan previously was co-founder and co-chair of the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership. Bud has deep roots in international business and community development. He served as Apple's Computer International Product Manager in the company's early days before co-founding Macromedia, where he oversaw the software company's expansion to offices in Europe and Asia as CEO. Following Macromedia, Bud was partner with Excel Partners, a venture capital firm. So welcome.
Thank you, Don, very much. Can you hear me okay? Yes. I'm very glad to be here. My real claim to fame is not those business things. It's in terms of our agricultural community. I have completed a one-year course in Focus Ag in Santa Cruz County. Yes, Jess Brown, who's the Farm Bureau person, and I spent a day on the farm with one of our organic farmers, and so I really enjoyed that, and I have always loved agriculture. I also worked in my early days as on a horse farm and baling hay at Bass Lake and getting the hay in Madero, and I have hay fever, so that was a tough summer. Anyway, I'm going to give you kind of a quick tour de force of our international objectives and a little bit about some of this you probably know, so I'm going to go very quickly. I have 37 slides and I have 20 minutes. Mostly I would like to hear your questions and commentary and dialogue with you about what's going on. So let's get right into it. I have written an op-ed, it's not published yet, but the first 4 or 5 slides here about why trade matters to all Californians. Because you hear a lot about, oh, well, you know, it's taking jobs away or imports or whatever. But as a matter of fact, there's $42 billion of foreign direct investment in California last year, $440 billion of imports, and about $313 billion of goods and services exports. And you hear a lot about the actual number is $172 billion, but that doesn't include any of the services. And we're increasingly a service economy. So it's almost equal services and goods when they're actually included in the number. And the $440 billion, 40% of imports into the United States, not just California, go into other parts. So we take 40% of all imports into the United States principally through Long Beach and LA. And so what you would expect is that the trade-supported jobs in California are rising. They were 11% of our California economy. It's a $2.9 trillion economy in 1992, and today they're over 20%. Trade supports well-paying California jobs in distribution. You can see the numbers here, in professional services, in personal services. And a little-known fact also is that firms that are importing or exporting pay their workers more, about 30% more than firms that do not. And trade supports California ag, of course, over 200,000 jobs. 70% of those are in California ag rural communities. And we support middle-class jobs as well. So these aren't ag jobs, but they're the jobs that deliver your agricultural products to the ports. Truck drivers, longshoremen, logistics managers. When I was down in the LA port, and I've already, I should also say, I've been on the job for about 5 weeks. Okay, so don't take all of this as, you know, well-informed yet. But I am a student of international business. That's why I'm doing this job. And as I said, I spent a lot of time thinking about these issues during my business career. Foreign investment creates California jobs, over 700,000. And you can see Japan, Great Britain, France, Switzerland, Germany are some of our biggest investors in California. So why do all these companies want to come here? They come here because of the shared values. Yes, our environmental values too, but also because we're a risk-taking community. We're an innovation community. We have an unrivaled diverse talent pool. Over 27% of people living in California today are foreign born. That's a rich cultural heritage and also helps with our exports. When I go to, I don't know if any of you from the Central Valley know Ago Dermagian. He's with Durco Foods. They have a multi-$100 million business exporting tree nuts, okay? And I was there a couple weeks ago. But his family was from Armenia, and after the genocide went to Lebanon. But, you know, sort of in their blood to know how to work in all these markets. And they export their tree nuts to 56 markets around the world. And of course, our reputation for innovation and leadership. Well, you all know, and you hear it all the time, we're the 5th largest economy of the world now. If you take out the US, only China, Japan, and Germany are bigger than California. But what you may not know is that we've been growing faster than the US, and that's why we've moved up. You know, we've been 8th and 7th and 6th, now we're 5th. We've been moving up because we're growing faster than the United States as well, at about a 3.2% annualized growth rate over the last 20 years. You hear a lot about Texas, right? Oh, Texas is stealing our companies, and Rick Perry is coming to take them all away. He's not governor anymore, but at the time he was. And you can see actually that we're growing about the same rate as Texas over the last 20 years, and much faster than New York. And if you look at countries, I didn't put China on here because they are growing quite a bit faster than we are. But when you look at our other countries that are large, UK, France, Germany, and Japan, California is growing much faster. And since the Great Recession, we have had the best change from unemployment of about 12.5% down to about 4.5%. So we've gained about 8 percentage points against unemployment, better than the other states, better than Texas, New York, Michigan, and Florida. So our recovery has been very resilient. And of course, I know you know this, but we're #1 in two-way trade, #1 in ag exports, #1 in electronics exports, #1 in machinery exports. And bigger than the 2 next biggest states, Iowa and Texas combined, in terms of our total agricultural volume. And so California is really an agricultural juggernaut. 21 billion of exports. We're 2% of the California economy, but 12% of exports in agriculture. So for my job, I care very much about agriculture and want to support you as well as I can going forward. And if you look at how that's grown over the last 10 years, yes, it's been a little flat over the last 4 or 5 years, but if you draw a straight line from 2007 up to 2017, you'll see that Cal Ag has grown from $11 billion to $21 billion. And here are the products: almonds, of course, dairy. I guess, Mike, almonds and dairy are good to be in, #1 and #2. But the other commodities as well. And why are California ag exports successful? Quality, high quality of products. And we complain sometimes about food safety regulations, but I think they mean a lot in the rest of the world. People know that they get a quality product from California. And our innovation and environmental sustainable products. And I'll talk a little bit more about innovation because Visit California has done us a very good favor in spending so much money marketing California around the concept of innovation. Many of the leading ag companies, I'm sorry if your company's not on here, but we have a lot. These are just a few. And of course, yeah, I'll do a better job at looking at the attendees next time. And of course, our public universities support agriculture with both off-campus extension programs, and 70% of our Cal Ag degrees are coming from the Cal State system. Okay, that's all the good news. What about things that we need to improve? Well, Governor Newsom has talked about inclusive growth and the 2 Californias. And in my first weeks, and I know this is true, my boss is Lenny Mendonça, who's the Chief Business and Economic Advisor to the governor. In my first 5 weeks, I've been to a lot of the ports, a lot of the airports, but I've also made it a point. On Friday, I was in the Inland Empire. last week ago, not this last week, but the week before that, I spent 2 days in the Central Valley. I went to the first meeting of the Central Valley District Export Council, which is cool, in Merced for the first time. And so I'll be going to Northern California soon. So we're really committed to making sure that the economic vitality in this state is felt in all parts of the state. We have a housing affordability issue, both for rent and buying a house. Our per capita income has not kept up, as you hear in the paper every day. The American Society of Civil Engineers does not think much of our infrastructure. Bridges, roads, and transit get C's and D's. And I hate to say this, but Texas is #1 in exports. Not ag exports, but they are #1 in total exports. Now, if you adjust for the price of oil, they are not doing as well as this graph shows. They are basically, I have another slide, but I didn't have enough time today. But that said, Texas and Louisiana are doing about the same, but Michigan, Illinois, New York, they're doing a better job. And California has not had a big commitment, I must say, to international. We've had 3 people, and Josh, over the last 8 years, and it's just not sufficient for an economy that's the 5th largest economy in the world. So I'll talk a little bit more of that. And finally, California ag has cost-related challenges. I'm sure you're all painfully aware of these. Low-cost agricultural producers overseas. If you're in Turkey making pistachios or hazelnuts, to why does Bruce Taylor go overseas and build a huge plant next to Querétaro in Mexico? Because it's cheaper, and he can get good quality and get his products to the United States quickly through freight. Changes in rules and tight labor market on wage rules mean higher costs and moving jobs to lower cost countries. Our port efficiency and bureaucracy, I think, could be improved from what I hear from agricultural exporters. And of course, the tariffs have played havoc with our exports, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. We also have other challenges mentioned earlier. Our surface and pumped water usage means uncertainty, lack of labor supply, and lack of comprehensive immigration reform, which we've been struggling with for a long time now. There has been a decreased investment in UC extension, and of course, the lack of broadband in rural communities. I spent a lot of times on this in the Monterey Bay region. It's true.
And your paper, may I say, is fantastic. The Monterey Bay
Economic Partnership. Yeah, we basically set new standards. I think it's 50 megabit download and 10 megabits upload, or 100, maybe it's 100 megabits download. But at my previous job, we published a paper on this topic, and we've been trying to spread it throughout the regions and get the PUC and other people to follow it. It's critical. Broadband is, we live in the 21st century. We have to do it. And finally, on the trade dispute, these numbers are shocking, and they might be worse as of Friday. Grapes from 13 to 53%. These are real numbers. I got these from Ago. These are what he's facing with. Walnuts from 5 to 45, almonds from 10 to 15. If you're interested, I have a complete spreadsheet with all the tree nuts and by country what the increase in tariffs have been. And it's hard to adjust momentarily to these tariffs. I mean, this has only been going on for the last 9 to 12 months, and all of a sudden, boom, you've got to readjust your supply chain and figure out how you're going to deal with it going forward. Okay, so that's the end of the bad news. Now, what are we going to do about it? I like this term. I actually stole it from the Port of Oakland, powering jobs and empowering communities. I think that's what we're all about, right? So first on California's agricultural issues. From the state standpoint, I'm having a meeting on May 23rd. I'm bringing a bunch of the economic development people together, but also a port and an airport representative in the state to talk about these bottlenecks and what we can do to improve them, border crossing times and so forth as well. We don't have control over, we do have control of our ports. We don't have control of the border. So there's some things we can do and some things that we can only jawbone about. I heard someone say earlier about the triple bottom line approach. I know it's Lenny's intent, my intent. We have a meeting later this week on a permit blitz to talk about facilitating permitting faster and what we can do about that. But I guess the overarching goal that we've established is the triple bottom line: economy, equity, and the environment. We can't forget the economy when we talk about equity and the environment. It has to be all three. And that's been the mantra of the California Stewardship Network, where I come from. It's been the mantra of California Forward. Those two organizations have just merged, and we want to embed that as a mantra within the state of California. You heard the previous speakers talk about the executive order on water from the governor. I think that's a great first step, and I know Karen will be intimately involved in that. And of course, the bad news about our commitment to international since 2003, when we closed all of our trade offices. We used to have 85 employees in international. Currently we have 3, but we are going to get to that. We're expanding the team. So the bad news is that they closed. The good news is that all of our regional partners really had to develop a tremendous amount of resiliency. And so that's why you have the LA Chamber and the World Trade Center and the LA EDC and San Diego Regional EDC and the San Diego Chamber. All these people, they're leading trade missions and they're very involved. And I know some of you probably participate in that. And we are going to rely on them a lot. But we're going to coordinate. We're going to share best practices. We're going to communicate so that we start to get more out of this network than we could get before with them individually. And then on the domestic side, we are following the trade agreements and immigration reform, of course. We're very hooked into the USTR on the USMCA, and we need to let the California congressional delegation take the lead because it's a federal issue, but we're monitoring that situation very carefully. In terms of my group's work, I mentioned the EDOs. For example, San Diego has a great export development program for small, medium-sized businesses. We don't need to create that. In Monterey County and Santa Cruz County, we were doing nothing. So, like, we have great exporters there, like Driscoll's, but what we want to do is teach new businesses, smaller ag businesses as well, to figure out how to learn how to be exporters. We hopefully, in the May revise, will get several in-state trade specialists, one focused on Asia, one focused on Europe, and one focused on the Americas. So more on that after June 15th, but that's our request. And certainly, we're not getting our fair share of STEP funds. So we are really going to start coordinating very closely with the U.S. Commercial Services offices. We're going to develop business plans for the top 10 to 15 export markets and really start coordinating with their in-country representatives as well as the offices here. We have 11 or 12 USCS offices in California, but we need to use them more effectively. And of course, targeted trade missions. We are reconsidering our foreign trade offices. Governor Newsom said that they need to be industry funded. I am really looking at the California Agricultural Marketing Act of 1937 and the Visit California Act of 1995 as my blueprint for how to move forward in international trade and investment. We don't have anything bought off yet, but want to move in that direction, and we are starting discussions about how we're going to restart. The first one is our Mexico office. Energize existing programs that we already have. Again, just more intentionality about these programs. Select USA is the big program for foreign investment. We do it in the Bay Area, in LA, Washington, D.C. I want to bring Select USA to Fresno in 2020. I want to bring Direct USA to the Inland Empire, to Riverside, Ontario area in 2020 as well. So try to get our inland areas more connected to foreign investment. Another federal program is the Opportunity Zones to attract investment in underserved areas, which we'll be working with. And finally, California competes using FDI in that. And in visiting Fresno, I met 2 different agricultural companies that had used Cal Competes tax credits to start their businesses. So I was really encouraged and believe this is an underutilized program within our state. And just a couple more things, leverage our network of our trade professionals. I mentioned the chambers, the EDCs, the World Trade Centers, the chambers and so forth, and communicate California's innovation brand. I mentioned Carolyn Betetta and what she's doing with Visit California. She's spending $120 million a year marketing California as the innovation capital of the world. Dream big is the tagline. Same with California Grown. How can we use these more effectively? I'm going to start attending their meetings and figure out where are they spending their money and try and float underneath that radar. And then differentiate California. We want people to know that we are open for business, we're open for visitors, and we want a red carpet out there. And I can't stress that enough. People love California. I spent last year 4.5 months in Spain on a sabbatical, and people would say to me, "Where are you from?" I would always say, "California." So they know it, they love it, and they love our products. So let's be open to that, and let's really express that in all of our communications. And finally, we have a Lieutenant Governor's Interagency Council, which will attempt to coordinate our work more effectively. Our first meeting is May 30th with the secretaries of the various agencies, and we will be really focusing that meeting on Mexico. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. Powering jobs, empowering communities is our theme, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Bud. We'll go ahead again.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if you could just articulate the Select USA and California Opportunity Zones, what are those and how those might be expanded, in your opinion?
Select USA is the federal government program from the U.S. Department of Commerce where they try and bring a lot of people to Washington, D.C., and these are foreign investors, and they are in every sector of the economy. What happens is that regions then try and piggyback on a lot of those people being here. So Select LA is June 5th and 6th, before Select USA, June 10th to 12th in DC, and then you have Select Bay Area on the 13th and 14th. So there's a little competition with all the states for who's going to get these guys to come. But I think from an agricultural economy perspective, I think we could attract a lot of those in that either before or after time frame to the Central Valley, to Northern California, and to the Inland Empire, the Coachella Valley. So I'd like to see more of that. Opportunity zones are the designations of underserved or low-income areas that now have tax breaks that have been passed by Congress. So investors will get certain tax breaks by investing in them. Some people are very suspicious of opportunity zones for especially real estate developers coming into their communities and deciding, oh, I can get tax breaks by investing here, right? But there's a group called Accelerator America and others that are really trying to get communities, regions, cities to actually create investment prospectuses. So if they have, like in the city of Louisville, just take, they probably have maybe 100 different opportunity zones, right? They're small little census tracts. But what do they want? What does the community want there, right? They want healthcare in one of them. They want mom and pop retail in another one. They want affordable housing in one. They want commerce in one, or they want mixed use in one, right? They should be the driving force rather than developers in how those opportunity zones are developed. And so I think we're going to see a mix because some cities won't get their act together, and developers will rush in with the greatest new idea, and then afterwards people will say, well, how did that benefit the community, right? So that's going to be the key with opportunity zones.
Well, fascinating. Am I to understand that your responsibilities are in the international trade bucket, so to speak, or do your responsibilities include economic development that isn't international?
Yes.
Yes?
I work in the Go Biz unit, which we will be renaming soon. It will be the Office of Economic Development. Don't say that outside of here, but just here. But because we want it to be more broad-based. But within the Office of Economic Development, we have the Infrastructure Bank. We have the Cal Competes tax credits. We have the Small Business Advocate. We have business investment grants and loans. We have international, that's me. We have the California Film Commission and so forth. So it's an entire set of either legislative directed programs that we administer or what we're trying to do overall with the economy.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. That was fabulous. You know, our farm economy is 2% of the California economy. Is that farm gate? Is that where you pick that number up, or is that at
Well, it's, what
at
did
a
I say,
wholesale?
50 billion
farm gate?
divided by 2 point.
Very good.
Divided by 2.9
Very good. So there's a
trillion.
lot potentially upsides to that. Exactly right. You know, and then I just say, you know, I work in rice and quinoa, but today, you know, I heard on the news those guys from Colorado, they're always trying to get into our business. They're trying to get into our mushroom business. Son of a gun. But yeah, exactly. Well, it's a different type of mushrooms, I think, than we produce here. But thank you so much. And Go Biz, I don't dislike that. That's a good one. We used
Like
to have
Go Biz.
a congressman, Biz Johnson. You know, that was our good
Well, we
slogan
don't,
for
we,
him.
we want to say that we're not just about business, but about the triple bottom line economic development of our state. Yeah, yeah.
Well, all you have to do is mention broadband and my microphone just lights up. And one of the things that I love about the Monterey paper is that it, if I understand it correctly, it seeks to set a template for what other areas can do to build their own community broadband, which
Yes.
is really important. So for communities that want to set their own destiny. And I was just in El Dorado County over the weekend, and they have a plan that they're trying to lift off, and I am wondering who I should put them in contact with at GoBiz.
Well, you can put them in contact with Anish, you think? Yeah. Yeah, Anish. Is he speaking at this? No?
Part of we're starting a state strategic planning session tomorrow, so Lenny designated him
Okay,
for now.
great. And if you want to talk to someone in Monterey, it would be Frenny Cooper. She is the Chief Operating Officer of the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, and she's running that now. There's a great consultant named Steve Blum. He is by far the best guy to talk to, and he does consulting for other counties and cities, and he knows more about rural broadband and broadband in general than almost anybody in California.
So if I can just follow up, I guess the bigger question is, you know, how can we get all of the other counties to know that this is even a possibility?
Well, I would say, gosh, why don't we make this paper available to Karen and her staff and see if we can't get it out. You're talking mostly about rural counties in California, right?
And-
Yes.
And there is an outstanding representative of rural counties is at the back of the room, Marianne Warmerdam. And RC has been extremely active on this topic. And I think we could also share it with CSAC as well. They have
Yes.
some crossover members and some not, so.
And also with the California Stewardship Network, which is merging now with California Forward. In the future will be called California Forward. That organization is now going to be headed up by a guy named Micah Weinberg. It used to be Jim Mayer. And I think if we just, I know they're aware of this paper, but we can make that paper available to them. And their representatives are in every region across the state. Those would be the areas I would say.
Just really quickly, in addition to that paper, can you also share your presentation with us? I'd love to have a copy of it.
Absolutely. Josh has it. You probably will have it in the next 5 minutes.
Thank you for the presentation. We're very proud of the fact that ag is the number one producing state in the country, but we are also the most highly regulated. And there's a huge cost to that, and there's been a paper published on that, which you might want to see. But my concern on the regulatory environment is the time it takes to get anything permitted. You can go a year and a half to get a permit. We're trying to get a dredging permit, for instance, in our irrigation district. We've been at it for over a year and a half, and now we've got a sandbar that we can't touch because we don't have a permit. And it's just, people, it's a snail's pace world in the regulatory environment. And, now that's created the safest food in the world, but at a huge cost. And so on an international basis, you bring the cost of some of the regulatory activities down, it makes us more competitive. But I'm not saying regulation should be out, but it has to be timely.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I mentioned I was just in Fresno. I met with Stuart Wolf from Wolf Farming. I met with Ago, as I mentioned. I met with the Valley Fig Growers. I've met with Miles Ryder at Driscoll's. I met with Bruce Taylor at Taylor Farms. Lenny and I are both aware. I got an earful in the Central Valley.
You shared some of the emails with me that you did. That's how much we correspond.
Yes, and we heard this in spades about AB 617, about which is a bill for lower income communities for around clean air, but has a big effects on the economy as well. And how are we going to manage to come to some sort of compromise around that? We heard about wage rules. We heard about permitting. And, you need to, those kind of meetings. And so I got it loud and clear, and I wrote up my notes from those meetings. Karen got them. Other people got them. And we're having a permit blitz discussion, I think, Thursday at GoBiz with Lenny's staff. And it needs to percolate up to the governor. It really does, for him to really understand these issues.
I can assure you, because I've taken him to meetings, he is very well briefed and very well aware.
Yes.
So he's looking to us as at the administration working together to offer him plans to address it.
Yes.
But he's very aware.
Then I just wanted to add a commercial to this. I greatly appreciate your acknowledgement of the decreased investment in UC Cooperative Extension.
Yes,
It is so important to agriculture in this state. And state colleges also provide a lot of benefit. But UC Cooperative Extension has taken extraordinary cuts previously during the downturn in the economy, and now because it's housed within the university's, the Office of the President, that office has been penalized, and consequently Cooperative Extension gets penalized, and we're not in that, or they are not in that fight. So we hope there can be some help to correct that, because their funding is lagging.
Yeah, the Lieutenant Governor is on the Board of Regents of UC and CSU, and I will send her a note after this meeting, and I'm sure Karen already has.
I think I introduced her to Glenda.
Oh, Glenda,
there you go.
But I'll reemphasize that point.
So, but we're going to have to cut it short
Yeah,
here.
no
We're way
worries.
behind on our schedule, and it's not fair for the rest of our panelists.
Thank you
that,
so much.
Are coming ahead, but thank you. Really appreciate you coming in. Thanks again. So, moving on to additional international trade and ag. Our next panel, Julie Adams, the Almond Board, Rain Thompson, Sunkist Growers and Fruit Growers Supply, Adam Halwell, from Bryant Christie, Inc., Tim Johnson, California Rice Commission. Rain is Vice President, Julie, let's start with Julie. Julie Adams, Vice President, Global Technology, Regulatory and Government Affairs at the Almond of California. Rain Thompson is Vice President of Governmental Relations and Public Policy for Sunkist Growers and Fruit Growers Supply Company. Adam Howell is a trade specialist with Bryant Christie, Inc., a firm that helps companies and industry organization throughout the U.S. develop, execute, evaluate market access strategies. And Tim Johnson is the president and CEO of the California Rice Commission. So we'd like to welcome everyone here today.
Thank you.
Go right ahead.
Okay, it is a pleasure to be here. Many thanks to the board and to Karen, always a pleasure. I have to say, Bud's comments about Ago Dermension, he has been a longtime supporter and engaged industry member on technical and regulatory issues. And I have to say, he's the one person when it comes to trade who will give you a straight story, whether you want to hear it or not. And usually if you're responsible or not, he will definitely let you know. So what I'd like to do is just take a few minutes and talk a bit about size and scope of the almond industry, what we've been engaged in, and really maybe talk through a couple of the specific issues that we're dealing with right now. If you look at the almond industry, as many of you know, we're one of California's top ag crops. Now, what's really key here as we look at the almond industry is, as you know, we're a federal marketing order, so we're funded by an assessment that is collected from the growers, a 3-cent a pound assessment. That's how the industry invests in marketing, in promotion activities, in dealing with food safety, compliance issues, and research, all of which I think have been key to our success and the reason why you've seen really remarkable growth to the point where we're at about a 5.8 billion farm gate value. But the thing is, trade really matters to the almond industry. 70% of what we produce gets exported. And we have the enviable point of being the largest producing country globally. So we're producing about 80% of global supply of almonds. The next largest competitor is Australia with about 8% and Spain at around 5%. So from our perspective, when 70% of our crop is going overseas, it's really essential. Not only that trade flows with minimal disruption, but we're in a position to make it possible for our industry to expand and invest in new opportunities. Now, if you look at the two graphs here, you can see the gold bars are increases in production. So we're seeing acreage increase and we're seeing production increase. We've been able to keep demand growing ahead of supply. And so if you look at our top 5 markets, including the US, that's 65% of total shipments. So we're fairly well diversified. We're shipping to about 100 countries. But what's, I think, essential for this conversation is if you look at the trade environment and what we're facing in terms of tariffs, technical issues, SPS issues, you can see here that we're facing challenges in virtually every market that we're shipping to. So the big focus has been on China, where, of course, we're seeing an increase from a 10% tariff to 50% on in-shell and kernels. But what I think is getting lost in the conversation as we talk about China, and particularly relevant, I'd say, to California, is that specialty crops here in the state were hit with the initial 232 tariffs. So we were the first wave in April. And I would say that we've been lost in that conversation. So as everything moved on in terms of talking about China, the big concern was what was going to happen with soybeans when 301 tariffs were put into effect over the summer. Well, that also hit specialty crops. So a number of us had a second increase in tariffs at that point. And so we're seeing this dialogue going on about infrastructure, IP issues, some of the larger commodities. And it's not to say that those aren't relevant and essential issues. China has been operating in a way that needs to be addressed. Nobody questions that. But the problem is, I'd say that agriculture to a large extent and specialty crops have almost become collateral damage in some of these conversations. From the almond industry perspective, we had a market access proposal that was just about to move forward in April. We had a Chinese audit team that was scheduled to come to look at access for pelletized almond hulls, which would be a brand new area for export. And that trip was delayed. And so I was just in China, was meeting with the office overseeing that market access proposal. They were ready to move forward and come to California, so we started talking about schedules. And then we had some of the developments this week. So nothing has changed in our schedule. We haven't heard of any disruption to the travel, but it's certainly something that we're monitoring and concerned about. The other thing I would just point out here is that tariffs are really only one of the issues that we're dealing with, and we'll talk in a minute about some of the other sanitary, phytosanitary, and non-tariff issues that are particularly a concern for our sectors. The other point I would make here that I think gets kind of overlooked in the conversation, we're actually, as California almonds, the #1 ag export for U.S. to India. So we're the #1 crop going in. In Europe, we're actually, tree nuts are the #1 ag export as a category. Almonds are second only to soybeans. So again, quite significant, and what we're finding is that we're becoming more and more part of the conversation in a lot of these markets and becoming more of a target. To give you an example of what has happened with China, just in the last 8 months as we look at our shipments, our overall shipments to China, Hong Kong over the last 8 months are down about 31%. And to the region, we're down about 5%. Now, because we ship to so many markets, we've been able to see some of that shift, but at softer pricing. And so as Rain and I were discussing earlier, it's easy to keep shipments up and sales going if you're looking at a fire sale. But, you know, if you're not getting the same value back to the industry, that's definitely a concern. If you look at our competitor, Australia, in the last 11 months, they've actually increased their shipments by 1,800%. Granted, that's from not a huge base, but it's still a significant shift in demand. And to the overall Asia-Pacific region, they're up 44%. So they're taking advantage of the situation we're finding ourselves in, and they're also taking advantage of a free trade agreement that basically went to zero as of January. So we have no agreement with China. Australia's at 0%, and we're seeing those effects play out in the market. The other point I wanted to make today is just to talk a little bit about some of the non-tariff issues. Tariffs are a very straightforward issue to focus on, and it's very simple to talk about this number should be that number and focus on that. But when you start talking about the other issues that really impact the movement of shipments into key markets, that I think is where we really need to focus more attention and find more creative ways of addressing problems. This is also one of the areas where in trade agreements that are being negotiated now, the importance of having some acknowledgement of dispute settlement. How do you deal with technical issues? Do you have a mechanism in place? So these are areas that we've been looking at. It also brings up the value of international organizations like Codex, where global standards are actually set. But one example I wanted to point out to the board is we have had a number of experiences recently with aflatoxin. This is a naturally occurring contaminant which affects a number of crops. So corn, peanuts, pistachios, almonds, many have to deal with this mycotoxin. Now, we had rejections a number of years ago, back in the mid-2000s. We instituted a program which actually resulted in bringing more confidence from the European perspective. It was based largely on focusing on regulations here in California and at a federal level, leveraging that, providing an equivalent program. And what it did was it actually put almonds in a position of being recognized by the EU for our pre-export program for almonds. And we're the only commodity in the United States that has this recognition. So we've been protecting this because in the past year with higher insect damage, we actually had more rejections in Europe. So we're working closely with U.S. Embassy, with USDA, with researchers, with the trade in Europe, and also in the member governments in some of these countries to also ensure that we can protect the integrity and confidence in our program. We're finding the same situation in Japan, but in that case, it's because the way they do their sampling and testing is not consistent with the way we're doing some of the testing here in the States. They don't recognize equivalency, and so rather than having a program where we can test in the U.S. and reduce frequency of testing overseas, that's not the way the Japanese operate. So as we look at trade negotiations and some of these approaches to the market, we can't lose sight of the fact that there are a number of different factors that are going to get in the way of business and get in the way of trade really happening for agriculture from California. So I think as we start looking at our opportunities and programs, we're really looking at the ways we can leverage understanding about what we're doing here in California, our investments in agriculture, in research, but also how we leverage the regulations that are here already in the U.S. and in California. Because that does bring confidence to a lot of these authorities overseas when they see the way those regulations are applied. But we're trying to do that in a way that doesn't create yet more burdens on ag as we go into these markets. So actually having a duplication of requirements that's really unnecessary. So from the standpoint of California almonds, I'd say that we're really committed to, I think, the global leadership we see that California and ag and our commodity can play in the world market. We've been very happy to cooperate with CDFA and with USDA and a number of the programs that are out there. And I would just say that the more engagement we can have with a lot of these countries in looking at memorandums of agreement, understanding of our practices, equivalency of controls, that's going to really help the industry in moving forward while we're still talking about these broader tariff issues that we can't get away from. So with that, thank you.
Thank you.
Questions now or at the end, or?
Go ahead, Nancy.
Do I understand the Japanese system that we send product, they test it, they reject it, and return it?
Yes, and that is true in most markets. So With our pre-export program in Europe, they test less than 1%. They've been testing more because of concerns with aflatoxin. Japan, because of their concerns, they're testing actually 100% of almonds, I think also pistachios, figs, and a number of other crops. And in Europe, we can reprocess or appeal and get those products moving. You don't have to bring them back. Japan does not recognize appeals, and it doesn't allow reprocessing. So if you have a rejection, you basically have to turn it around, bring it back to the U.S., and then deal with the challenges of FDA's own goods return program, which is not the subject of today's conversation. So. So. All right, thank you.
Josh, do I need to do anything? Okay. Well, when it does happen, yeah, when it does happen, I'm Rain with Sunkist. We are the largest exporter of U.S. citrus around the world. We're a co-op owned by 2,500 California and Arizona growers. So even though we're a large brand, and we are really a U.S.-owned cooperative. I just want to, I'm going to kind of take a slightly different take on trade. Oops, there was hope. Do I need to do something? Okay. It's okay. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach. Almonds have an amazing story since they are really the world supplier. Citrus, we do have a lot of foreign competition, both in the domestic marketplace as well as foreign marketplace. So we have a slightly different dynamic of what we look at. Okay, red. Oh, thank you. I like how there's actually stickies on here too, which I did not pay attention to. Just looking at U.S. citrus exports, these have slightly changed. These are our major markets. These are for not just for Sunkist, but for all of U.S. citrus exports. Really, Asia is the area we focus on, as well as Canada. And South Korea, China, Hong Kong, we put that as one market, Canada, Japan, and Mexico. All others are Singapore, Malaysia, Australia, and the EU has a very small portion as well. Because of the U.S.-China trade negotiations that as of Friday midnight are going to get even more exciting, we have seen a significant loss of market share there. We've lost 25% of our exports. We don't have final numbers in because, of course, we're still in the season right now. And we're not too sure how China is going to react to this additional 25% tariff that will be placed on them. And of course, negotiations start tomorrow. So we will see the response of the Chinese. It's a very important market for us, specifically Sunkist. We're, 60% of U.S. exports to that market. And what we notice in that market is that we can command a very high price for our product, not only because of the brand, but because of the quality. And we compete very well against cheaper foreign suppliers there. If you look at, we go into that marketplace for $30, $35 a carton. Egypt comes in at $10 a carton, South Africa at $12 a carton. With these tariffs, we're now at $50 to $55 a carton. We are seeing other loss slightly in South Korea, and then we're seeing some gains in Japan. But many of these markets can't absorb the loss that we're facing, as well as a lot of these markets are pretty mature. Japan, I'm sure many of you know, is already a very mature market. We are concerned about the free trade agreements that other foreign suppliers have to that marketplace and what tariff benefits they're going to receive over us. But we have grown that market out a lot, and we see some growth, but it's not going to be significant. And that's really where we are different. I think fresh products coming from California, not just fruits, but also vegetables, is really when we look at where can we be competitive in the marketplace. You do have the applied tariff. That is really important. You have the shipping distance and costs. It takes 30 days to get to Asia, and the costs that are associated with it. For instance, India is a market that a lot of people talk about. Let's go to India. They have a growing They have a growing economy there, growing middle class. It's great for almonds. For citrus, the shipping is too long. And then when we go into that marketplace, we cannot compete. Sunkist actually markets foreign fruit there, Egyptian fruit there, because they're looking at maybe a price point of $8 a carton, which we cannot simply do going into that. So we're looking at every single market. We've basically opened every market citrus have that is available. There are, of course, the hurdles of phytosanitary issues and then other foreign suppliers. So looking at the EU, for instance, we do ship to the EU. However, there aren't a lot of market gains there because they already have their own cheap suppliers. Spain is a huge citrus producer, supplies very cheaply, as well as South Africa. So we can't compete at the price point to make it worth it. And then can the customer afford it? If you go into Latin America, we always get this from USDA. Well, look, we gave them access to the US and now you can ship to Argentina or Brazil. Isn't that fabulous? Well, they already produce enough citrus to, make, 10 pounds of lemonade, and they don't need our lemons, and they also can't afford our lemons when getting there. So we do really focus on those markets that have the greatest potential for us, and also those markets we can get to. What I want to also focus on is the domestic market. 70 to 75% of what we produce in the United States has to be absorbed into the domestic market to create that balance. Foreign suppliers can produce and ship for a lot cheaper than we can, especially when we're selling on the East Coast. So I know a lot of people say focus on export market growth. Yes, there is growth there. It is something we have to develop. Those things take time to develop, whether it's because of a free trade agreement as well as building the consumer demand there. They take time. It doesn't happen overnight. And really the domestic market is a very key component to our stability and to a farmer's stability in the marketplace. And I think we're seeing a lot over the last 5 years, and huge increase in citrus imports into the U.S., and it's driving down prices. And we're feeling that for kind of the first time than we felt it before. I did include just the top 5 markets, and this is for all of U.S. agriculture. So, these are beef, soybeans, everyone, and you can see that, some of these markets for a lot of California producers, not all, but, Mexico, for instance, it's not really a big market. They produce a lot of fruits and vegetables there, and they can produce them very, very cheaply. We talked about the EU. So really Canada, China, Japan are some key ones for a lot of the fresh products that we produce here. So that's just the short, simple, and dirty. Any questions? Okie doke. Oh.
Just curious, are you feeling the impacts of citrus greening affecting your phytosanitary exports and things like that?
So because it hasn't yet established itself in orchards, we feel the effects of the costs, the increased costs for making sure that the disease does not enter orchards, and we expect it will only go up if we happen to find it. So we're preparing ourselves for it. If you do look at Florida, they've lost 60% of their production, which is significant, and so other states we're learning from their experience right now.
And were you guys aware that in the Farm Bill, they added a 100% match to the emergency citrus research area? Okay.
Yes, and some have been working on that issue.
We need help
just
on that.
last week, yeah, they were meeting last week with USDA on that.
Great.
So
Thank you.
I think they're looking at a fix to that, some language. I know the House Republicans were drafting some language as a fix for that.
Thank you, Rain, for your presentation. The fruit that this Sunkist produces is beautiful and diverse. Do our export markets take the whole range of citrus products, or is the focus on a few of the major ones, oranges and lemons, or does it take the whole range of citrus that California produces?
It does take the whole range where, focusing on growth on grapefruits, caracaras, blood, some of those specialty citrus that we have now. Also on the higher bricks, the sweeter citrus. So we are really diversifying our marketing efforts, and they are taking that product, and we're seeing that growth in primarily the Asian markets. So it's interesting to see that there versus here, whereas like South Korea, they focus on the high bricks product, and we actually market it that way. So we're using different marketing techniques in those markets versus here. So not everything, but they take a lot. So, okey-doke.
I have no presentation, so you're going to have to listen to my words, I'm afraid. I'll try not to hit various buttons. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Adam Hollowell, and I'm a trade policy specialist for Bryant Christie. For those of you who maybe aren't quite as familiar with our company, we are an international affairs management company, and we work for clients in the agri-food and beverage sector. Primarily, my work a lot is with the agricultural associations. So our clients are essentially growers, and our mission really is to open, expand, maintain market access for exports of US ag, including California ag. Working towards this, we have a number of teams in Bryant Christie that work towards enhancing market access. We have marketing teams, teams that specialize in overseas market research and regulatory intelligence. We have a number of technical databases that are increasingly important and are focused on overseas tolerances for pesticide MRLs, food additives, contaminants, and also veterinary drugs. And then there's my shop, which is the Global Access team, and I work on a whole range of issues, but primarily tariffs, technical issues, and the SPS issues that were mentioned earlier. So it's busy times. I should pause here and note that my accent is not a typical Californian accent, as I'm sure you're aware. I'm originally from the UK, but I've been in California now for the past 4 or so years. So I like to consider myself a Californian, and I'm proud to be one. I'm proud to work on behalf of California agriculture too, because it's second to none. Just hearing some of the statistics that Bud mentioned earlier, and reviewing the California Agriculture Statistics Review report before this presentation, because I'm a bit of a nerd in that way. The numbers are really impressive. California obviously being the nation's leader when it comes to production and export, over 20 billion, as Bud mentioned. So thinking toward the role that California agriculture can play internationally, first and foremost, it's to continue to do what it's doing in many regards, to continue to lead the way on a whole range of aspects. But to do so and to be successful, I think, particularly in agriculture, you can never stand still. So I think there's a number of 3 main areas that I think that California can continue to build upon when it comes to its international success. The first is to continue to set the standard when it comes to sanitary and phytosanitary programs, particularly with regard to pest and disease control. This is really essential in my role, both when we're negotiating new market access, to be able to state to another country that certain pests of quarantine concern for them are either not present at all in California or are subject to rigorous quarantine programs, is an essential tool in our toolbox, and one that takes a lot of work and a lot of investment to maintain. So continuing to make sure that those programs are funded and maintained is essential, really. And California sets the standard for this, and it's to continue to do so is a lot of work, but it's essential. Secondly, a second point, really for California to continue to be the strong partner that it is to USDA and other federal agencies. In my role, I work primarily with USDA, with USTR, with other federal agencies, but we and they couldn't do what we do without the state and the county officials on the ground. Donald mentioned earlier on about the UC co-op extensions. Those are vital to our role. They're vital to the pest management programs that we have in place. The state and county officials, on an operational standpoint, conducting the phytosanitary inspections, issuing the phytosanitary certificates. This is essential. So ensuring that county and state offices are funded and staffed is really important. I was in Bakersfield a few weeks ago with a delegation of Chinese, which is always pleasant. And for our entry meeting, the room was full of state and county officials. And to be able to turn to them to have that expertise on hand is really important. They're the eyes and ears on the ground. Away from personnel, and it's something that Julie touched on in her presentation, data and analytics is actually increasingly important. It sounds pretty dry and I suppose techie, which is kind of California, I suppose. But I mentioned the databases that Bryant Christie provides to growers in the US, dealing with pesticide maximum residue levels, among other things. We are seeing in our work an increasing focus on MRLs. MRLs are increasingly being used or increasingly becoming key barriers to trade in many regards. As a lot of countries are establishing national MRL systems, it's more important than ever to ensure that growers in California are informed and they have access to information. And some of our databases provide that information, but to do so, we rely heavily on data from CDFA and other agencies to identify which products growers use are important to them, so that we can then work with overseas governments and establish those MRLs or ensure that those MRLs are harmonized. So in continuing to ensure that that data is available is really essential to our work. And then the third point then, which I think Bud also briefly mentioned, is just to continue to leverage the brand that is California. I can speak as someone coming from the UK. California really is a powerful brand. And I think now working in agriculture, California agriculture is synonymous with high quality. And in some of our own marketing campaigns that Bryant Christie has conducted, we've leveraged the California grown aspect. So ensuring that funding mechanisms are in place. We use the specialty crop block grant a lot in our work, but ensuring those mechanisms are in place to empower organizations like ours and other associations to market California overseas is important. And working in emerging markets too, using the brand of California, bringing those delegations here, showing them the measures we have in place, the quality of the fruit, really, really is important. So those are the three areas I think I would highlight, but that's all I've got. So, questions?
I have a question. What's an MRL?
Sorry, yeah, pesticide, a maximum residue level. So, yeah, I can.
Thank you for bringing those items up, Adam. How do you encourage your clients to protect themselves from the MRL? We have a diverse agriculture in California. Crops, neighboring crops, crops in a region have different materials or products being used, and we are subject to possibly wind or movement. Do you recommend significant testing prior to export, or do you? What is your? We have certain customers that require testing on all shipments, and we find that sometimes customers when it gets there use different levels than we test here.
Mm-hmm.
And then the biggest one we find is in our area, which is a rice crop, is a mosquito and vector control material that gets used for health and public safety that shows up sometimes on a wild rice crop.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do
Well, I don't deal with the actual practical application of the testing. I mean, our company, we deal with on a global basis, providing growers information about the tolerances that US has in terms of the application, MRLs that are tolerances, and also those in overseas markets. In terms of testing and best practice, I can't really comment on that. That's a bit too, excuse the pun, in the weeds for my work. But I can certainly discuss it with my colleagues and see if they have thoughts.
Could you comment on for your customers and for your customers you have that work in export markets on the technology of CRISPR and the technology or the growing method of organic and how those engage in your for your customers in trade?
Again, that's very. That's not really within the remit of my role. I'm aware that certain clients we work with would like to see a greater role of maybe advanced technologies as part of, for example, free trade agreements. I know that when it comes to the FTA front, a lot of markets have heavy restrictions when it comes to those. I can't comment on the pros and cons of that, but yes, I don't deal with the specific kind of technical side of things, so apologies about that. I'm a bit of a trade policy nerd. That's my sharp bait. They lock me away, and that's what I do. Great. Thank you very much.
Karen, when did you get the dentist shop open up next door? Yeah.
Well, you're going to win here, Rain. We're going to let you keep your slide up because I have neither a PowerPoint or a cool accent. So that's the reason why you left me for last. Thanks, Josh. I realize I've not been here in a while because you now have a beard that's gray. And it's gray, you know. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Secretary, members of the board, for the chance to speak to you today. I'm Tim Johnson, President and CEO of the California Rice Commission. For those not familiar, we represent the state's rice farmers, several of which are here today. Hi, guys. And also all the state's rice mills and marketing organizations. We grow rice in California, about 500,000 acres in the state, right, primarily in the Sacramento Valley. And we're known for a particular kind of rice, the short and medium grain rices that you see in sushi that I had this afternoon with the tour group that we had, also in Korean cuisine, right? So that Japanese sushi rice, no matter really where you eat it in the United States, came right here from the Sacramento Valley. So while rice is often thought of as one of the big Title I crops in the Farm Bill, the rice we grow here is actually special, aren't we all? And so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about our markets, and I'm going to approach today's presentation with some specific comments about how the efforts of this administration can be helpful, I think, to California. There are a lot of things that bother all of us. Most of them, frankly, are not issues that we can address directly here, right? A lot of them are federal concerns. You've heard those raised. I do think we have some opportunities in that regard. But I'll specifically address the California opportunities. First, and I want to commend the administration and the department always for focusing on the fact that agricultural exports are important. They're critical, right? Half of the California rice crop is exported. Our major export market is Japan, then South Korea and Taiwan. We're not yet in China, but we expect to be as soon as the current tweet storm is resolved. But having said that, exports are critical to our industry. I would say probably almost every single commodity group that would come before you has a real key role, some more than others, but always important. So exports are important. We also export rice to Turkey, Syria, and Jordan, as well as the European Union. So our rice goes to a lot of different places, about, in fact, 40 different countries. And where does that rice go out of, right? It goes out of the port of Sacramento or West Sacramento, ports of Stockton, and also the port of Oakland in containers. And so we impact, right, a lot more than just the rural communities where we grow our rice, and I'll talk more about those communities in a minute. But our footprint is big. You saw us on the list before. It's always great to be there, even if you have to bring up the backside for almonds. But we are a significant crop. We export significant amounts of rice, and all told about $5 billion to the state's economy between the farm gate as well as the additive jobs. the things that you can help us the most with is we sort of look at, what are the things that the state of California, what are the things that the administration can do to help us with this vital market? And I'm really going to go back to the time I remember when we had the discussion in the legislature, right, Madam Secretary, about whether we're going to keep these export offices around. Did it matter? And I think at the time my view was, maybe it matters, maybe it doesn't, right? I don't remember anybody in agriculture, quite frankly, getting all of that focused on this. And I think that was a mistake in hindsight. And why is that? It's because what did we see in the absence of California having our export offices? Well, every other state, right, many of them quite aggressively, really started courting specifically California or the markets that we export to, the same maybe markets that they do, not only the products that they grow and sell, but why don't you come and bring your business here too, right? And let's not forget that if somebody's buying rice from California, they understand the quality, maybe the right thing for them to do next is to locate right here in West Sacramento, right? Maybe make some rice products, maybe recruit food safety technology experts from UC Davis to assist them. We also see the same thing in ag chem companies, right? It's a shrinking world. But again, come to California. Let's get that UC Davis expertise. Let's get that proximity to California agriculture. So what those offices did best for us is really highlight and focus on the fact that California agricultural products are really of the highest quality, right? Many of the other speakers have addressed that. It's also seen as some of the safest food in the world, right? While we may complain and be concerned about the permit and all of the rest of the things that are difficult and challenging, at the end of the day, we do know that we can say with certainty that we're regulated not only at the federal level, but even more so at the state level, right? So there's some benefit to be received from that. We're reliable suppliers of their product, right? We can put product in a ship, on a plane, we can get it to them 365 days a year, exactly the way they want it, exactly when they want it, and not every country or export state that we're dealing with can really provide that same benefit. I would also say that the California image is hugely important. As was mentioned by the previous speaker, the fact that you're from California, right? First thing you say is, oh, you're in agriculture, do you know about UC Davis? They talk about that. They talk about the quality of the products. They talk about the image of California. We have frankly lost that. We can now say we're California rice, but we used to be able to go right and work with the trade offices, which we did extensively. Most of the marketing programs that are statewide or national stand up before you say that we spend a lot of money on international promotion, right? We participate in those MAP and FMD programs. We in rice, with our contractors through our national organization and the countries that I mentioned, would frequently partner with California trade offices, California booth and all the rest of that. We had governors that frequently would tour and leverage that as well. And we just don't have that anymore. Now we have to go stand next to the U.S. Trade booth. And I got to tell you, sometimes that's fine. Sometimes that's not maybe as much of an advantage as standing next to the California flag and doing that. I really do support the efforts to again draw a spotlight to California ag exports and how important that is. I look forward to continuing dialogue with the administration. I really do want to pick up in my closing comments on a comment that was made relative to the triple bottom line. All right. So Sacramento is a great example of a little city who finally figured out that it was close to agriculture about 7 or so years ago. Look at all this really great stuff that we do that happens out on the dirt roads, right? Where those tractors drive. And we clearly, were something they didn't think, much about. But they did start to focus on the economic benefit, right? Again, that connection to exports. Well, I know I like food, but how do I feel about exporting rice? How do I feel about exporting almonds? So we got them very clearly on the economic benefit. But we also had an opportunity to educate them, and this group has an opportunity to educate the administration, and the administration, our legislators, on the importance also to our rural communities. We don't grow our crops, largely, right in the middle of downtown. We grow them in small little communities like Colusa, Richvale, if you've ever been there, the Richvale Cafe. Bryce might let you park in his spot, okay? rural communities in California that are every bit as rural as any place else in the United States. Places that, quite frankly, are overlooked as people drive from Sacramento to San Francisco and San Francisco to LA. It is those communities, those disadvantaged communities. What are the jobs that they rely on? Ag and ag-related businesses. And certainly in the case of rice, we also provide significant environmental benefit from the growing of our crop. Right? Water that you apply to rice grows a great crop. You eat our sushi. We also know, and you heard earlier today, that water applied to our fields can grow salmon. It already grows waterfowl in the tens of millions that come and migrate here and spend the winters here. So if this administration, if this department is looking for that triple bottom line, I can think of no better place to focus than agriculture. And quite frankly, agricultural exports, because if you took agricultural exports out of the state of California, you would see drastically diminished, and I would say probably in some cases eliminated industries from our state. So thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today.
Thank you, Tim. Do we have any questions? Come on, Don. Bryce?
Oh,
Job, Tim, great job.
thanks, Don.
Good, make it a difficult one.
Well, it is always difficult ones. Tim handles them all. Tim, thank you for your references to rice as the environmental crop. When it comes to your farmers' exports to Asia, do they appreciate the work with birds and salmon and utilize that as they bring your products to Asia, or is that mostly something here for our own legislators, regulators, consumers when it comes to resources here in California?
You know, I'd say 10 years ago it was probably just a domestic marketing, message that we sent, but increasingly we're sending all of the same images, all of the same information to Japan. I think other high-end markets are certainly looking for some of those values, especially, in countries where they're not seeing those same benefits in their own countryside. The other thing that we get an awful lot of academic groups through is, how is it that you change the farming practices so that, you can provide some of this environmental benefit. We get a lot of credibility for that within the government circles as well as within the trade circles. So I'd say increasingly, Europe certainly, right? A lot of that, we're finding ourselves doing what probably most of the rest are, is really using that information that you generate on the environmental benefits, on your community benefits more broadly.
Are you translating any of the films that we saw today into other languages that you can use in foreign countries to promote California rice?
Well, the first language we had to translate it out of was water. And I think we've done a pretty good job of that, Don. And to talk more about from the environmental side. No, to be honest with you, this is a project that has garnered more interest, I think, than even we had expected, which is, I think, just outstanding for agriculture. Look at the things we can do on our fields. If we just apply a little bit of ingenuity and to one of the earlier comments from the board, folks just sort of adequately stay out of our way. There's a lot of stuff that's really interesting that we can do out there, really regardless of the crop that you are.
I agree with you. Brain?
Very good. I don't know if this is the right thing. I just wanted I know a lot of people are talking about building export offices overseas, and I kind of wanted to counter that a little bit. As a marketer, as a sales company that's in a lot of markets, we didn't use those offices before I was around when they were here, and I was also around during their demise. Because marketers, if we have an issue, and we have a lot of issues in country, specifically with shipments with China, we're not going to call a state negotiator to deal with that issue. We're really going to call USTR and FAS. And FAS does pretty robust in countries already. So I would just think very wisely about how to use that resource. It's great for trade missions. Governors are fabulous going to countries to promote the California brand. And and connect us. But a lot of us are already connected with importers and exporters and anyone who is. I think small exporters, helping them with training on how to get into markets. You know, I've facilitated those programs. They can be important. But building export market offices for states, they're very glamorous. They're great for dinner parties, but it doesn't actually facilitate trade, I think, the way that people want them to. So those would just be my, hate to be a naysayer, but I would be careful about how much resources we put into that when there are a lot of issues on the table right now.
I guess my question is, so, go ahead, Tim.
Completely agree with what Rain had said. There's some really great value. It's very specific. And I'll address sort of the elephant in the room, because I take that role on myself, is that, the reality is we don't like the tariff situation. We don't like the trade agreements we have. The single biggest thing that this administration can do, and the single biggest thing that we can do, is to engage our California delegation and tell them that these trade agreements and these tariffs are important. Period. And if we can't get there, then the rest of this probably isn't going to matter much to us. Thank you for having us and the nice bottle of water. And if you bring a group over from China, we'll certainly entertain them. But to be honest with you, if we can't get to the California delegation, tell them the ag trade is critical, and quite frankly, find a way to work with this administration rather than trying to always find ways to not work with this administration in Washington, regardless of how you feel about it, we're going to get relegated to right where we're at right now. And I don't mean to be political about it, but everything is political. And the folks that are suffering are those of us who are trying to fill up containers and vessels and ship product.
So I would like to thank you for that comment, because Josh and I have been in a lot, like more than all of the last 8 years and just the last month and a half, conversations with the co-chairs of the International Committee. The co-chairs are the Lieutenant Governor and Lenny Mendonça. And I would strongly encourage, I'm sure at some point this board may want to send its own letter, but I think it would be very important for a large coalition of agricultural organizations to say exactly that. We're not trying to communicate to the whole world. We need to focus on our very large and potentially could be more influential than it has been in other times, with a message to be able to speak specifically to the ag pieces of this. If we ask them to do everything, we might not be as successful as really reinforcing some of the points that Bud made about what it means for agriculture and rural communities and the equity issues that we're trying to address with the generation of jobs there. So I would encourage you to think about that with your colleagues, just as I'm sure this board will consider doing something similar. Thanks, Tim.
Do we have any other questions? Go ahead, Chris.
Julie, excuse me, I might have missed it in your presentation. When you identified the Australian kind of small but gap-filling example, so what, if crystal ball, things work out in the end on the tariff situation, I mean, what's the likelihood that the losses you have experienced, you gain any share, and if so, what percentage of share back when there is a resolution?
I think we stand a very good chance at regaining and exceeding where we were. We were looking at increases, year-on-year increases of minimum 6 to 8% growth in China and probably more. I'd say one of the biggest issues is that with reduction in tariffs, you'll see greater normalization of trade flow. So it'll be easier for product to move directly into China rather than via Hong Kong or Vietnam or other markets, which is one of the advantages the Australians have right now. From a quality perspective, most of the Chinese trade has said that they prefer California product. So I think we definitely would see that shift back. In fact, what is happening is the overall market in China is down. So rather than importing or just substituting, what they're doing is just bringing enough product in to keep items on the shelf, keep goods moving, but you're just not seeing the expansion. And I think that's what's going to happen once tariffs are down.
I know, I just got back from Australia, and they told me their price of wine grapes doubled once the tariffs came on in California. Their market opened up wide open, so, and, yeah, occasionally it is hard to get markets back, you know. I know California, we have almonds, we're the big guys on the block, but, yeah, there's a lot of other commodities that suffer.
Well, I mentioned to Rain earlier, one of the interesting outcomes of the situation is that our exports to Australia are up 70%. So,
Great.
you know, what is happening is a
That
lot
must
of
have
our
been what I
product
took
is
them in my
staying.
suitcase.
Yeah, it's staying in Australia, and then they're exporting Australian almonds. So we're filling the Australian market.
Don, go ahead.
Have you looked at the pittance of a payment that came from USDA as compared to, I'm familiar with the almonds, so, I mean, in terms of lost market share?
Yeah.
I mean, what's that? I mean, I looked at that payment and I thought, you gotta be kidding. You think that's really gonna help an almond grower? I mean, it was.
Yeah, I'd say that the sentiment was similar. Yeah. Yeah, I think we looked at a much larger loss because it wasn't just what was happening in China, but what the effects were more broadly. And overall shipments, if you look at where we are, overall shipments are only down about 1.5%. But that's because things have shifted. We've seen more go domestically, and prices definitely softened. So that point that you can keep things moving, but the return to the grower was not as good. So growers have lost money over this whole process.
Has the Almond Board come up with a number in terms of what the loss to the industry is?
I think the last number I saw was generated by Sumner. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was definitely the case. But the other problem I'd say with that market facilitation program is the almond industry and almond growers generally have not participated in any of those direct payment programs. So we're estimating that maybe half the growers will utilize maybe a third of the funds that were allocated.
Yeah, you have the AGI component that knocks everybody out. Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your information here today. So the secretary has to be out of here pretty quick, so what we thought we'd do a quick departmental update before we get to the end here.
Yes,
So Karen?
I will be very brief. I know that many of you have already noted, and it was mentioned today, the governor's executive order last week directing EPA, Resources, and CDFA to begin the work now on creating the water resiliency portfolio. Taking a look at a lot of the data that's out there, lessons that have been learned, what has been completed under the California Water Action Plan, and build a new portfolio approach to ensure that we're really focused on resilience to climate change, water resiliency, and as much as possible, really taking into account local resiliency as contributing to that statewide resiliency. That will be a big project for us, and obviously it will be very important for our water subcommittee to get active again, and I know that Mr. Bransford had already suggested that before this executive order was announced. But I also know that we're looking forward to asking the state board to factor in this set of topics into future agendas, and especially future agendas in places around the state, so that we're truly engaging a really extensive stakeholder input. So that's something for us all to start planning on together. As I mentioned before, Josh and I have been, and Josh especially, has been in a lot of meetings. It is exciting to see the administration really focus on international trade and all aspects of it, and to see how they're building the infrastructure for us to be effective in whatever that agenda will look like. But it is important to the governor, and we're very fortunate to have the lieutenant governor as a former ambassador being able to pick up the phone and make some of the calls that she's doing. So a lot of really good work going on in that. I wanted to update you on our virulent Newcastle's disease in Southern California. We are now with a find of a disease flock in Arizona. That's in addition to the earlier flock that was discovered in Idaho, but seemed to be very isolated. And our fingers are crossed it continues to be that way in Arizona. There was also an infected, just a couple of birds, backyard birds that were in the Bay Area, which sounded the alarms for the big center of poultry production. So far, that has been very isolated, dealt with it swiftly, and that's thanks to the ongoing education to all of our clinics and veterinarians and feed stores to really be vigilant on that. But there's increasing resistance and social media coverage, and so we're doing pretty extensive legislative outreach and really trying to engage folks. I know Dr. Jones just this morning did a briefing for several Southern California lawmakers, as well as an LA Times reporter, to be able to continue the work that we're doing on that. We also are finding in some of the same neighborhoods more, and this is not unexpected, this goes to our citrus program, and continuing to find infected trees. It's troubling for me that instead of finding 12 a week or 13 a week, the last couple of weeks have been 30, but they're all in the same communities. They're all where the reservoir of the disease has been. And it's a real tribute to our staff and the community members who continue to want to be very cooperative, that we continue to make the progress that we are making. I wanted to touch on dairy because Mike's here, and how could I not touch on dairy? And wouldn't it be nice if we all had the magic solution for the woes of dairy that's happening here and across the country? But we are still staff is going through a verification process. We received a petition not quite a month ago, almost a month ago, asking for a referendum to eliminate the quota program that we established as part of the industry voting to go into the federal milk marketing order. And it's a pretty extensive process just because of business ownerships and making sure that the people who signed the quota are eligible to vote should there be a referendum. And then we'll be making some decisions of whether that should be referred to the producer review board or if there's some alternatives to deal with what the industry wants to do with its future. But it is bubbling out there, and I can't stress enough the world of hurt. I'm sorry we didn't have a dairy representative today, but their story is very similar to what we've heard, and in some ways even tougher because they're a down market, there's an oversupply, they're eating a lot of those tariffs to keep shelf space, and so it's just exacerbating a really challenging situation. And then I just wanted to close with the emphasis on healthy soils and biodiversity and the natural working lands. That presentation you heard this morning truly is the evidence of a focus on natural working lands to sequester carbon and to help us with our climate issues, but also produce so many other multiple benefits, are exactly the kinds of projects that smart government programs and investments pursue. And I think there's unlimited opportunities for this board to really dig into some of that and lead the way on that. And I wanted to close with, it is the energy of this board highlighting the issue, and Joy, who is relentless on it, that has now pushed broadband out of us. We help push it, but it is now an administration-wide event. Tomorrow's meeting to start the strategic planning is being organized and led by the governor's office with this multiple agencies being involved. We now have a catalog of all the funding sources. The governor has received a letter that the PUC is working on a response for making sure that California knows about the Reconnect funds, which require some state funds, which are available through the PUC. So I think we'll start to see even more work happening on this and happening on an administration-wide basis. So if we don't bring it back here as often while we're working on it, just know that it was your leadership and this woman's energy that, like, they had to deal with it or else, right, Joy?
Thank you, Joy. I really appreciate that, so thank you, Karen.
Sorry, I have to rush out of here. Thanks.
Thank you.
See you next month.
Okay, what I'd like to know is, what would you guys like to do? We had several topics this morning and trade this afternoon. Would you like, I guess we need direction if we need to write a letter of support in one area or another. Yes, Joy?
I love the idea of sending a letter to the California delegation. I just think that that is, well, not that, I mean, I have a long list of things I think we should address to the California delegation, but I think that trade is certainly one of them. And I think that a good reminding would be in order.
I agree with you.
And just for clarification, are you saying to our state legislators, or are you saying to our federal Congress?
Our federal
level? Yeah,
congressional delegation.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, we're advising the governor and the secretary. And
Let staff
however-
work on that and see. Yeah.
Why
Let
don't
me
you
see
see what
our-
you can do,
yeah,
Josh,
let me
for
check
us?
on that one.
And if we have to go to this, maybe just the state legislator and the governor, that,
Well, again,
that-
your
that
statutory
may-
ability is to advise both the governor and the secretary, so we can.
maybe we can
Well, I think-
wordsmith it to where it comes out to where we copy them on something. A letter to the state. Exactly.
Or we can send a letter to the governor asking him to please forward.
Please make, yeah.
Or we can just let Josh ask it.
I will just write the congressional delegation, don't worry.
See what you can do, Josh.
Yeah.
All right, anything about this morning's meeting on additional habitat or working together on multiple fronts?
So, I would recommend that. I think
I think that's a great idea.
if I could, I think the governor's executive order and the work with the department, I think it puts us in a good position to be able to maybe recommend to the secretary what outreach could be done in the agricultural sector, where and when. I mean, putting together kind of a timetable would be good.
What I'm not clear on is his executive order directs Karen and company to look at the water action plan and climate change. So then, is the intent to then vet that with the state board, or does the state board preempt that and just provide input that, well, here's what we think the priorities should be? Or how are you all thinking you're gonna manage this?
With our board here, I think I would see that the department would definitely like to partner in terms of the outreach, is my assumption. In terms of having those stakeholder engagements to hear from the communities in terms of the importance of the issues.
Okay, so we partner with the outreach, then do we come up with priorities?
I think that is definitely I think that's definitely a role that this department, this board can take. I don't know if that would be in coordination with the department or if we could provide separate recommendations to the board.
Just find out if they prefer to have us make recommendations.
Well, I think if we can sit together as the water committee and come up with kind of what our thoughts are on the EO and the role that we would like to play as a board in that, and to run that by the secretary and the board, I think would be the best.
I was just gonna make folks aware, if you're not already, that the flood managed aquifer recharge program that we helped get started, about 18 months ago, their research advisory committee will be coming out with its sort of top priorities. And they're planning to hold some sort of workshop around it and webinar, and so it seems like that would be a great place for us to engage again.
No, that's correct. That's great.
Would it be appropriate for them to present here at some point?
DWR,
Yeah, sure.
come in and just do a presentation on Floodmar.
Yeah, I think it'd be best is, my recommendation would be to have the water committee meet prior to our next board meeting and have present to the board at our next meeting kind of what the recommendations are going forward in terms of outreach and potential actions that the board could take.
Yeah, Josh, maybe before leaving, the conversation on trade. From Bud's presentation, I thought they did a very good job from the business and economic development side to capture data as it relates to trade's important to the California, particularly the California agricultural economy, 203 or 7,000 ag jobs created, et cetera, et cetera. But what I didn't see, and it wasn't his fault, it might have just been the timing of when he presented versus the presentation of the panel we just left, is, for many commodities, particularly those I'm intimately familiar with, I mean, trade, whether it's the expansion of trade or the development of new markets, that's really their only mechanism for surviving into the future, particularly for those that are here in California. That's it. It's survivability for them. They're tapped out with the domestic market, and they have to get new markets, particularly for those that are permanent crop fresh fruit growers in the San Joaquin Valley when they're looking at potential Pacific Rim trading partners. And so is there a dialogue we can deepen with our role as an advisor to the governor, specifically with Bud's office as it relates to identifying, California actions, California policies that have had an impact, largely negative, I won't say pro, but largely negative as it relates to the cost of production for this commodity, that if it weren't for trade or expanding trade, for example, for these commodities, California would not be able to sustain that type of production within this state. Therefore, right, in limited examples, and I'm trying to be as narrow as I can, we're only going to exacerbate to the extent we can move certain commodities more so into the footprint of Mexico, Chile, and others in the Southern Hemisphere, just to be able to compete as companies overall. What I'm getting at is, I think there's something that we're missing as it relates to the governor's business office and how they look at California policy's impact onto the cost of production, and how if it weren't for trade, or if it weren't for California's ability to engage the trade conversation from the role of expanding, we're missing the boat on survivability for many of these California farming operations. And so to me, not before, but maybe in addition to this conversation and this dialogue we're having as it relates to our influence onto a congressional delegation, I at least see a role for us in deepening the dialogue with the governor's business office to make sure that to the extent we can help guide, spotlight, or develop, those talking points, that's clearly within the narrative as it relates to how the governor sees California's reaction on a suite of policy measures. I just think that could be a role, or should be a continued role for this board to promote and protect the sustainability and survivability of California agricultural operations.
So I think, I agree. I think a challenge that we have, and is, even if we go back to the process that we started a while back with Ag Vision, is just we always have the challenge of, yes, regulations are impact. I mean, it's that standard big cloud, and to really kind of narrow it down to what are those key things that really help move the needle, is where you run into that challenge all the time. And I think I think the more we can do to kind of highlight some of those challenges, highlight the permitting delays, things like that are definitely, look, these are key issues that are impacting businesses economically, I think that's where we have the best benefit. But you're right. I think sitting down, having the opportunity to sit down and engage more with the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development would be good as well, just to kind of provide that narrative.
Well, I'm a little concerned that it's kind of feels like business as usual to me, and we are, rapidly approaching even more of a climate challenge in terms of agriculture. So I wonder if we could get the presentation from the Fresno researcher who did the 30-year study on ag in California, so that we could look at strategically what are the crops that are going to be viable in California over the long term. Because if we're investing a lot of money in creating markets for crops that really are not going to be grown here, it seems like we should take a broader long-term view. I just want to, it's very sobering, but I think resources are going to be allocated carefully.
I think there's some work being done with the UC system in terms of trying to develop a study, and I know that I think the Secretary has been in some discussions in terms of doing an outlook for ag for what, to 2050, 2020 or 2050 in terms of some of the economic impacts. And so I think once that study comes out to kind of further have that discussion, and that might be a good time to join it with the Fresno presentation as well.
Yeah, and I know that, what is it?
Thank you.
Lawrence Berkeley also is doing work there too. We've met with them, and they have some interesting projections too. So I know that we can bring other people in too. Okay, any other questions? If not, yep.
Don, on the morning presentation that we had with Ellen from PPIC, I
Yes.
was wondering if there's any way to request some funds for Sigma, recognizing that there'll be 500,000 acres coming out, and I think she referenced that there was maybe 50 million in a certain fund and 150 in a different fund, but I'm not sure if we would want to put a pencil to what kind of funds are necessary to be effective.
Yeah, I agree with you, Bryce. I mean, we know we did get some money down in our region to for Sigma implementation, but it's minuscule when you look at the costs involved in Sigma. So maybe we can have the Water Committee also take a look at that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there was, I think, 450 million in Prop 3, and when I used to go around talking to other areas, they kind of said, "Oh, what is 450 million going to do?" And
sad but true.
Ellen did have a good point in her presentation where she talked about maybe there's partnership potential with California and USDA funding, especially in a lot of the Farm Bill programs, and to maybe have that conversation with the state office to see what flexibility is there in those programs for kind of a large-scale project in the state, focusing on Sigma, for instance.
Yeah, they're engaged. No, I know we deal with them on our project with DWR, and there's a portion that's NRCS funded, an RCPP program. So we have dual funding into that project. So they have, NRCS is understanding and is becoming a higher priority for NRCS. Right, Mm-hmm. Well, we figure a minimum of $1 million for each to get a GSP done, minimum. Right, that portion out of the way.
Well, and I think that, again, I think Ellen, or the PPIC's work in terms of really kind of laying out some of the directions and some of those key questions are maybe a good guiding post for the board in that outreach as well. Because, I mean, those are some of the key, issues or approaches that are there, and what's happening in the various region, how best can they respond, that might be a good direction as well.
And maybe prioritization of areas that need additional funding.
So
you got a lot of work, Don.
Are we crafting a letter to Governor Newsom on water, or that'll come out of the Water Committee, congratulating him or thanking him for the executive order, focusing on multi-beneficial uses, and his focus on voluntary agreements, and I really appreciate his focus on collaboration and on getting accomplishments done. I don't know if there's a way we could request his help in staying on the positive. I believe there's an awful lot of positive things going on in the voluntary agreements. I am concerned that there would be litigators on the side, and that's just, there are always going to be litigators on the side, but as much as possible, if they're NGOs that Governor Newsom has relationships with, or that the state engages, that we would encourage continued positive engagement from all parties.
So I also direct Don to maybe take that into consideration with the committee, because it should come from the committee to the board, I think.
And remembering that I always think it's important to keep the sewers separate from the water interests. I mean, I'm sorry, the sewers being the litigators.
Okay, any other comments? If not, word, sorry?
On the letter, do we want, I mean, do you want to, I mean, obviously, direct staff, why don't I'll just draft the letter,
If you could,
and then
then,
you can have it for next one. No, I'll draft,
Yeah.
and you guys can have it next time to go around. Okay.
all right, appreciate it, Josh. So our meeting is formally adjourned. If you'll hang around for a minute, though, one more thing. I appreciate that. So, also, public comment, I apologize. Anybody, do we have anyone that would like to speak before the board?
I'm good, I'm just checking out Dr. Burhay.
All right, so we really appreciated the lunch, that was fantastic. So thank you again.
So my name's Michael, for the record, Harris. The idea that we have famine in West Horn or Africa, we're going to use appropriate technology in California and the breeding of Dr. Burhay to develop some California varieties that we can use in East Africa to feed. There's about 6 million teff growers that can eat what you just ate today at lunch, and then use systems that the package is Dr. Burhay. I'll be quiet, but we're going to use this to end famine in East Africa.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure, a great privilege to speak to this August board. Just give me 5 minutes and I'll be done. My name is Tarek Burhay. I'm of Ethiopian origin, but I have been U.S. citizen for the last 33 years. I'm a graduate of Washington State and University of Nebraska. Mostly I have been working in Africa, but I'm now retired and living in Arizona. I have been invited by this beautiful lady. I didn't know before, but she wanted to grow teff in the Sacramento Valley. Teff is an ancient, very tiny grain cereal in Ethiopia, but now becoming a world citizen because of its health value. So if we grow it successfully in this valley, what is the benefit of teff? I think the #1 benefit will be health. I'm sure most of you know that 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 Americans suffer either from celiac disease or from gluten or are diabetic, osteoporosis, anemia. And this crop happens to be a natural cure, a natural medicine against all these diseases. So California is great, as we have heard, in many crops and in many things. Why not add one thing more? Contribute to the health of the nation. I think it will be a fantastic thing. The other benefits I can mention too of teff is water economy. I think you have been talking about water. You can grow this crop with 50–60% of the amount of water you need for alfalfa. So it can grow with less water than most crops. Rice, wheat, and so on. Maybe on the in the long run, as we have been talking about environmental issues, what will be the future crops of California. It may contribute also to the diversity or to the biodiversity of the Californian agriculture. So I don't want to say much more, but we think that this crop will make it here. In fact, I was in the other room where we ate the lunch with Stephen Gera, and he said California sun state. I said, what a coincidence, because in Ethiopia, we pride ourselves by saying 13 months of sunshine in Ethiopia. We are smart. How did we get 13? Our calendar counting is 30 days for each month, and then at the end of the year, we get a 5-day or 6-day month, 13th month. We don't get salary for it, but but we say Ethiopia is a country of 13 days of sunshine. So I'm sure I will be seeing you sometime in the future, but it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
So one last item. So the state fair gala is on Thursday, June 27th, where they celebrate the agriculturalist of the year, which happens to be our own Secretary Karen. June 27th. June 27th, which is a Thursday. 5:30 is Best of California Wine, Cheese, Beer, and Olive Oil tasting event. At 7 o'clock is their pool. A 10-person table is sponsorship is $17.50. So it's just, is the board interested in getting a table? Would you like Don to coordinate that? Having me coordinate on that on his behalf? I mean, is there interest? Would you guys already have? How would you like to do it?
I would like to be there, so please count me in.
Could you send us an email? I mean, not necessarily about who's doing that, but I mean, just so we can put that.
Yes. It's at the fairgrounds, yes.
Twitter also puts 5,000 and 10,000
So, correct. So the one table is the bronze level sponsorship at Secretary. So that's where.
Is your name going to be at the top there, Price? Lumber Farm?
Well, I haven't gotten the contact for it.
Okay, so, so I'll send out a note. I guess what I'll do is I will send a note out to everyone, and then maybe respond to me if there's something I can do. And if you want to get as a board to get a table.
Well, one of the great celebrations to celebrate Secretary Ross.
Yeah.
No doubt.
So what time, you say there, it starts about
5:30 was. I think it's about 75% California. Yeah.
Last time I was there, it was a lot of Cal Poly. My hand was tired.